All right, today we are talking about and we are cooking up winter squash, and I have a couple different varieties here that I like the most, that will be used in different ways. I'm going to talk through them, but what we're going to cook with is the Delicata squash, and this is just a much larger and a much smaller Delicata squash. Something that I really like about it is just how versatile it is. So we're going to talk about 3 different ways to cook a Delicata squash. It's bred so that the skin is edible, which I think just makes it really wonderful and simple and is a part of it being versatile. And you can find them in different color variations and all sorts of different sizes. So if I'm just me as a single person, I like getting just smaller Delicata squash because this is going to be one meal. This would be cooking for multiple people, right? So it's something that I like about Delicata squash, and that's what we'll cook with. But I wanted to talk about a couple other favorites that you'll find at the Winter Farmers Market. There's the butternut squash, very classic for cutting up and cubing and roasting and including in winter salads or just as a side dish with some other roasted vegetables. A butternut squash is always a great pick. This is a butternut squash on the smaller side. Again, I'm just buying a smaller squash because I'm only feeding myself. If I was gonna make butternut squash soup, which is something that I do, I might buy a much larger squash to roast and put into soup. A more recent squash that you may be familiar with if you're shopping at the farmer's market, but otherwise may not have seen, is the honey nut. This is a pretty big one. They don't get a lot bigger than this. They are smaller than its relative, the butternut squash, but a honey nut is darker, a little bit wider, right? It doesn't have the neck of the butternut squash, and is bred to be sweeter and has a flavor to me in the ones that I've had more like a pumpkin. So again, something you might want to roast on a sheet pan with other vegetables or put into a hearty winter salad. And there's the red curry squash I just wanted to mention quickly because it's great for muffins or quick breads. So anyone who's baking out there, this is a great option for a squash you're gonna cut open and roast and then scoop out the insides to bake with. And at the farmer's market, the wonderful thing is you're talking to the people oftentimes who grew your food, so you can, based on what you're going to do, you can ask what type of squash would be best. And the farmer or the person working at the farmer's market for the farmer is most likely gonna know and have some tips and tricks for you as far as how you wanna use the squash. They can offer some suggestions. So here's my little baby Delicata. It's like single serving. I'm gonna hold it really strong. Try to find like the flattest side of it so it's not gonna wiggle around on me. And I am just gonna cut it right in half. I've got a pretty good knife, so I was able to do that. If the Delicata has a stem on top, you just wanna make a cut and cut off the stem before cutting it in half. But here is my Delicata squash. I've got the seeds inside, and I am going to scoop out the seeds just right into my compost bowl. Whatever you've got in the kitchen, right? We'll make it work. And I'm not scooping out a lot of flesh. There's still a little bit of the strings inside. I'm perfectly fine with that. Not squeamish about it. I'm just scooping out the seeds. They're going into my compost, but like pumpkin seeds that you may have done with a jack-o'-lantern, you can also, of course, roast up any squash seeds. So sometimes I might save these and keep them and roast them up, just have them as a snack or add to another dish. So I've got my cleaned out little Delicata squash, and I'm just going to prepare it most simply. This side had the stem in it, so I'm going to discard it. I'm going to cut it into half moons And the smaller I cut my squash, the quicker it's gonna cook, right? So I'm doing about quarter inch little half moons. I've got the flat side of the squash facing the cutting board, so it's not gonna slip away from me. Just go all the way down the squash and get it on the pan. Here's my handful of half moons. And cook up as much or as little as you want. I'm gonna set this squash aside just since I'm showing you these, but you know, if you have a big delicata squash, cut it all into half moons depending on serving size, how many folks you're feeding. Just straight onto the pan, I'm gonna drizzle a little bit of oil, sprinkle a little bit of salt, and grind a little bit of pepper. I didn't mention it, but my oven is preheating. It's on 450, so it's pretty hot. And I'm gonna take that olive oil, salt and pepper, I'll come around and just toss with my hand, I don't mind. And it's really easy to see when you've coated all your little half moons. They're glistening. They've got their salt and pepper on them. You can do a whole sheet full or however many you want to serve yourself. And these are going to go into the oven. They're going to get caramelized and brown. I slice them so thinly, I'm thinking this will take about 15 minutes. We'll pop them in there and I'll let you know when they come out, how long it took. We'll wait for those delicatas to cook. All right, we're gonna grab our half moon roasted delicata squash out of the oven. These were in there for about 12 minutes. Remember, we cut them really thin, and they've got some caramelization on the bottom of them. They've roasted and turned a little bit brown, and so they're ready to eat. I was gonna say, because we cut them so thin, they cooked in about 12 minutes. If they were thicker slices, they're gonna take a little bit longer, but you can always stab one and take a taste. And those are great. Delicata squash, you can eat the skin, super simple and versatile. Just drizzled with some olive oil, salt and pepper, and those are ready to be a side dish. The next thing that we'll talk about is another way to make a delicata squash. That was a really quick roasting of it. We've still got our whole delicata squash here. Remember, I like the small ones because I'm making a single serving just for one person. And in our oven, I've got a half of a delicata squash, just like this one, that's been roasting. And it's going to serve as the vehicle. It's really hot right now, right? I just pulled it out. It's gonna serve as our bowl to make a stuffed squash, and I'll show it to you in just a second. Let me give it the opportunity to cool down. While I talk about what I did, there's another way. If you're at home and you don't have an oven, something that I've always thought is very cool is it's simple to cook a small squash in the microwave oven. So I've cut this one in half. I need to scoop out the seeds. I'll put them into my compost bowl. I could save the seeds if I wanted to roast them, like pumpkin seeds, have a little snack. I've got a nice clean scoop, but I'm not too worried about there being some strings. And at this point, if I wanted to put this into the oven or the microwave, I just want to make sure, I want to check my dish, right? And make sure that it's microwave safe. If I was going to put it into the oven, I'd want to make sure it was oven safe. But what I'm going to do with the vessel that I pick, this dish is microwave safe, I'm going to take my scooped Delicata squash and put it flat side down. And this is a pretty shallow plate, but it will work that if I take some water, I put in this bowl, a little bit's gonna spill, and that's okay. I put water onto this plate and it's creating a seal around the squash. It's hard to see because it's water on a white plate, but there's a very thin layer of water in the bottom of this dish that's creating a seal around the squash. I'm gonna pop this half of a squash into the microwave after I give it a couple little pierces with a fork. It's still hard, right? I haven't cooked it, but I'm able to take my fork and pierce some holes into it to let steam escape. I'm gonna take this squash, I'm gonna put it into a microwave oven. This squash is very small, so I'm gonna start out with 3 minutes and then give it a test with a fork, poke it, and give it another 60 seconds if needed. As soon as your fork can very cleanly go into the squash, it's ready to eat. Remember, this is a delicata, so it has a very thin skin. It's bred so that you're able to eat it. We're gonna be able to eat this whole squash when it's done in the microwave oven. Try 3 minutes, and then another about 60-second increments until it's finished. Make sure you've got a microwave safe plate. That's a wonderful way. You could then just cut it up or eat it with a fork. And you could do that with really any type of squash. A delicata is a very quick cooking squash. A bigger squash is going to have to go a lot longer, but you can play that gauged on the size of your squash and the type. Definitely recommend a delicata as a quick cooking microwave squash. And so now, to set that microwave option aside, I've got a half of a delicata squash that I cooked in the oven, and it's going to be a stuffed squash. It's still, I'm not going to grab the vessel yet, it's still hot, but my fork very cleanly pierced this delicata squash, and it's now a little bowl that I'm going to fill with a stuffing. So the squash is mostly cooked. You're aiming for it to be about half cooked. I am going to, again, not touch it because it's too hot. I'm going to set it on my baking dish. My baking dish is cooled down. I'm going to take off my half moons. We're making squash these 3 simple ways. Pull my half moons. I'm going to use the same dish that I just baked my half moons on. I've got my delicata squash half cooked. It was in the oven, again, still at 450 for about 10 minutes. So I could pierce it with a fork, but it's not too soft yet. I'm going to prepare filling to go inside of it. So I've got most of my ingredients are already ready. We're doing that fancy cooking show situation where some things happened off camera. I've got some wild rice. You could use any type of rice that you like or prefer. Making a stuffed squash is a great option for leftover rice. So this was left over from a meal the other night, and I'm going to use it to stuff a squash. Brown rice would work just as well. Quinoa is another grain that you could put into a stuffed squash. I've got some chopped nuts. Walnuts or hazelnuts is something that you could get at the farmer's market this time of year. I've got some pecans, and you could toast them on the oven or on the stove if you wanted to. You could give them a little bit of a toast. And I already sauteed half of a very small onion. I've got that here in my bowl. And you'll look at the recipes for proportions. I'm going to be eyeballing things. I've also got some cranberries, and then I'm going to cut some apple. Is something I really like to include in a stuffed squash. And I'm also going to cut some celery. So I cleaned this celery rib, Just gonna cut it into nice bite sizes. If you like stuffing, like with bread, you can make a filling for a stuffed squash with bread as well. And it's really is, making a stuffed squash is really a choose your own adventure. You want to make things to your taste. You want to make something that you're going to enjoy and you're going to eat. I like the crunch of it. It's nice to have something crunchy, something savory. We can talk about the different ingredients as they go in. Let me also prepare some apple. The nice tight tart bite of a green apple is a good addition to any stuffing, whether it be with bread or with rice. Great use of leftover rice. I can't say that enough. It's nice to make big batches of things and know you can use them all week long in different dishes. And I'm dicing everything. I'm cutting it to a nice diced bite size. I need, so you can see the proportions as I add them. I'm gonna grab a mixing bowl. Here it is. So I have got, I'll talk about it as I add it to the bowl. I've got some leftover rice. The proportions, of course, like use the recipe to guide you, but don't get too caught up on that. If you really know you like one of these ingredients, celery for a little bit of crunch. So I had a grain or a bread, some celery for a crunch, some nuts, a nice soft, easy to eat nut. You could toast it if you want to. Some just very slowly sauteed onion. This happened off camera. Just some sauteed onion. Cranberries, always good. Dried cranberries for a little bit of a zing. And some green apple for some little bites. So I have this big old bowl, but I'll bring it over to you so I can tip it and you can see. I think something I would have done is made the celery a little bit smaller, but it will certainly work. I like the big apple bites because they're gonna grab onto the fork well. And this is just a good mixture of some tart and savory ingredients that we are just going to simply, making sure my pan's not hot, it's not, pour into our squash. And remember, our squash is half cooked. It was in the oven for 10 minutes already. If you, speaking of catering this to your taste, if you like cheese, cheese is a really wonderful addition to stuffed squash. I know it's an unpopular opinion, but I'm not a big cheese fan, but that's something you could add and toss into your mixture. Yeah, just a really simple, like choose what you like, use this as a guide, but don't feel like you need to stick to it. Here is, you'll see it when it comes out of the oven, but here it is. It's just a mound of that beautiful stuffing put into a partially cooked delicata squash. That's our little bowl that we're gonna keep it in. And it's gonna go into the oven for another 10 minutes at 450. So it's a pretty hot oven. And really all of these things are cooked or ready to eat. We're just gonna let the flavors meld and mix together and the squash get a little bit more cooked and caramelized and toasty. So it's going into the oven. And we'll keep an eye on it and probably see it in about 10 minutes. All right, we are ready to pull our stuffed delicata squash out of the oven. Oh, it's beautiful. Got nice and toasty, the ingredients on top. You can hear it sizzling. It's still cooking. Very carefully, that was only 10 more minutes that squash was in there. And it was really like all of the ingredients were cooked. I was using leftover rice. The celery just needs a little bit of cooking. The apple, those raw ingredients didn't need to be in the oven very long. We're really just letting the flavors meld. So I've got my beautiful stuffed squash here that's just like fork soft, ready, remember with the delicata that you can eat the skin. So it's just like ready to bite right into this. And here it is finished, very similar to what it looked like before it went in, but you can see there's a little bit more caramelization and toasting. This is the delicata squash, so we did it 3 ways. We've got our stuffed squash here. Here is our microwave squash. I decided I did want to put this delicata in the microwave to see how long it took. It took in 4 minutes. It is very fork tender and ready for a little bit of butter and salt and pepper, and just ready to bite right into. Easy to scoop out the insides, or remember that you can eat the skin on delicata. And then we've got our little half moons, which are like falling apart. They're so tender, but I wouldn't call them mushy. They were just tossed in a simple olive oil, salt and pepper. So here we've got our 3 ways to just simply cook a delicata squash. And of course, always, you've probably got your handy salt and pepper. I remembered that I did not season with salt and pepper my stuffed squash, so it's something I'd want to do now to just finish it off. Ideally, you do. In the recipe, you'll see like blend those flavors in there when it's cooking, but sometimes you forget, and then you just salt and pepper it at the end to taste, and it works out almost just as well. So here we go. 3 simple ways to eat delicata squash.